Welcome to the deep dive. It's really something how economies that look pretty solid on the surface can actually have these, well, hidden weaknesses.
Hmm.
Today, we're diving deep into a really critical point for Canada. It's all about its economic future. We're talking trade, those dependencies it has, and what strategic moves it can make in this, well, frankly, rapidly changing world.
Absolutely. The
So
landscape is shifting fast.
yeah, and we've pulled together a whole stack of sources, articles, research papers, various reports to try and cut through some of the noise for you, the listener, and get to what really matters.
Lots to dig into.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, first glance, you look at 2024, Canada's economy seemed, well, okay. Modest GDP growth, inflation kind of holding steady at 2.5%. But our sources pretty much immediately point to these, what they term dangerous dependencies hiding underneath.
Yeah, and what jumps out immediately is just how much Canada relies on the U.S. It's quite stark, almost 76%, $547 billion worth of exports heading south.
Three quarters, that's
Uh,
massive.
it is. And we really saw how exposed this makes Canada back in early 2025 when the U.S. suddenly slapped on those 25% tariffs on certain Canadian goods.
Right.
That caused, what was it, a 15.7% drop in those specific exports. It really forced Canadian businesses to, look elsewhere fast.
And the total trade back and forth was $924 billion in 2024. I mean, it's the biggest bilateral trade relationship globally. Huge numbers. But, and this is where our sources say it gets really interesting, there are these structural issues.
Hmm.
Like Canada's persistent trade deficit, $44.6 billion,
Hmm.
especially in manufactured goods. That seems like a key point.
It is key. It points to this sort of imbalance, and it connects directly to the reliance on natural resources.
Yeah.
Energy products alone make up over a quarter, 27.1%, or $195 billion of merchandise exports.
Wow.
So that makes the whole economy really vulnerable to, commodity price swings, up and down, very volatile.
And on top of that, there's this thing the Bank of Canada called a productivity crisis. I mean, emergency levels was the phrase used. Canadian productivity is what, only 72% of US levels
Right.
and falling for 6 quarters straight?
Yeah, 6 consecutive quarters, that's deeply concerning. It's not just some abstract number. It really hits Canada's ability to compete long-term, maintain living standards.
So what's behind that?
A lot of it seems to tie back to investment or maybe underinvestment. U.S. firms, they invest about 11% of their GDP in things like machinery, equipment, intellectual property. Canada, it's closer to 8%. That gap matters.
And you see it in specific sectors too, like motor vehicles and parts. Usually Canada's second biggest export, right? $80 billion or so.
Wow.
But that saw a dip about 7.4% in 2024, partly because of all the retooling for EVs.
That's right. Big transition costs there.
And then, as you said, natural resources, energy, metals, forestry, nearly half of all exports. So super exposed, not just to market swings, but also increasingly to shifts in climate policy.
Exactly. Double vulnerability there.
Almost locked in relationship with the U.S. You'd think diversifying would be priority number one. But the sources show it's complicated. Geopolitics gets in the way, especially with, say, China. Like that retaliation we saw from China against Canadian EV tariffs, 100% tariffs on canola, 25% on seafood and pork. That hit about $3 billion in Canadian exports, right?
Yeah, it's a real balancing act with China. There's potential, definitely.
Yeah.
Agriculture, for instance, China's projected to be the biggest consumer market for many key Canadian products by
There's
2028.
huge potential there.
But political friction just keeps cropping up. It's like this ongoing canola dispute that affects Canada's biggest agri-export to China, which was $1.86 billion just in Q2 2024. It shows how quickly these economic ties can get, well, weaponized.
And what about natural resources? Seems like potential there too. Critical minerals, especially. Canada sends a lot of metallurgical coal to China, 27% of their imports. And China needs Canadian copper, lithium, rare earths for all its green tech.
True, the demand is there. But then you run into major roadblocks. Canada itself has put restrictions on Chinese investment in critical minerals. Plus, there's huge pressure from the U.S. for friendshoring, basically, keep supply chains within allied countries.
Right, that term keeps coming up.
It makes expanding significantly into China for those minerals very, very difficult right now.
And then there's the whole security angle, which seems to be overshadowing trade more and more. We saw the Communications Security Establishment report, didn't we, about Chinese state actors compromising Canadian government networks.
And then the reports about Canadian universities doing joint research, hundreds of papers with Chinese military institutions on pretty sensitive stuff.
That can't help things.
No, and it feeds directly into pressure from, the Five Eyes intelligence alliance. These security worries basically create political limits that go way beyond just economics. Canada's hands get tied, even if a deal looks good on paper.
And for manufacturing and tech, the sources say the barriers are just really high. That structural trade imbalance is massive. Canada imports something like $89 billion from China versus much, much lower exports the other way.
Exactly. Plus, Chinese state subsidies give their manufacturers a huge edge that's tough for Canadian companies to compete against. And services trade, it just hasn't taken off, despite, theoretical potential.
So the takeaway on China is limited.
Yeah, expert assessments are pretty consistent on this. Short-term expansion potential looks quite limited. With the current tariffs flying back and forth and the political climate, substantial growth near-term seems unlikely. Medium-term, very uncertain. Depends a lot on geopolitics.
Okay, so if China's tricky, what about other options? The sources point pretty strongly towards Europe, the EU, as maybe a more promising path for diversification. They talk about Europe's substantial absorption capacity.
Yes, and there's already a solid framework in place. The numbers, since CETA, there's the trade deal between Canada and the EU, came into effect provisionally in 2017, are actually quite impressive.
What do they show?
Bilateral trade is up 72%. It's hit $125 billion. That's significant growth.
72%. Wow. And what about specific areas like agriculture, which we talked about with China?
Well, the EU is a massive importer of agri-food, 122 billion annually. For things like cereals, oilseeds, meat, that represents about a quarter of their consumption. So yes, huge potential for Canadian farmers and producers.
And CETA helps unlock that.
Absolutely. CETA is key. It gets rid of 99% of tariff lines. That gives Canadian goods an edge. Plus, things like mutual recognition of standards cut down on compliance costs, red tape, and there's ongoing regulatory cooperation.
And is Europe actually buying more?
Oh, yeah. The data shows real absorption. Since CETA started, EU imports of Canadian base metals are up 143%, minerals up 131%, fertilizers up 225%. These aren't small numbers.
That's concrete evidence. So, sector-wise, where are the big opportunities beyond agriculture?
Well, energy is massive. Europe is actively, strategically trying to diversify away from Russian supplies, so there's huge potential for Canadian energy exports, LNG, for instance. And critical minerals, it aligns perfectly with the EU's own goals for strategic autonomy under their Critical Raw Materials Act. Canada has what Europe needs.
Process.
And actually, the strongest growth area since CETA has been services, up 90% to almost $49 billion. Professional services, architects, engineers, they benefit from mutual recognition. And the digital economy, still lots of room to grow there.
What about logistics? Getting stuff across the Atlantic must cost more than just sending it south.
It does, but it seems manageable. Halifax and Montreal are the key gateways. They have direct shipping routes, competitive transit times, and often Canadian products are positioned as premium goods so they could absorb slightly higher transport costs.
Are there still hurdles with the EU? Oh, sure. It's not perfect. EU regulations can be complex. There are still some tariff rate quotas on sensitive products, limited amounts that can come in tariff-free. But the regulatory cooperation is ongoing, and if all EU members fully ratify CETA, some haven't yet, that would streamline things even further. Overall, the outlook seems pretty positive.
Okay, so Europe looks promising for diversification. But let's circle back to the elephant in the room, or maybe the bison next door. What about going deeper with the U.S.? Our sources dive into this big question: how much more integration makes sense?
Right. Some analysts, like Nouriel Roubini, make a bold case for basically a full economic union. A single North American market, US, Canada, Mexico, arguing it would benefit everyone way more than tinkering around the edges.
A single market, like the EU.
Sort of, yeah. And the potential benefits, based on economic modeling and looking at the EU example, could be substantial. EU membership boosted GDP by an average of 9% for its members, sometimes way higher for smaller countries, up to 50%.
9% boost on average. For North America, Bank of Canada research points to specific gains.
Yeah.
Getting rid of things like anti-dumping duties permanently, harmonizing regulations which cuts costs, reducing transaction costs because you wouldn't have exchange rate swings, and boosting productivity through more competition.
And that productivity point keeps coming back, doesn't it? Canada at 72% of U.S. levels, with 76% of exports already going there. The argument for closing that gap through integration seems, well, pretty compelling on paper.
It does. And the sources push back against what they call the mythical fears of a race to the bottom on social standards or wages. They point to Europe, where you have very different social models coexisting within that single market.
Okay, so what would that look like practically? How would it help with current issues?
We'll take the softwood lumber dispute. Decades has been going on.
Yeah.
Harmonized regulations could just end it permanently. Those tit-for-tat tariffs on steel and aluminum. Impossible in a true single market. And compliance costs at the border estimates are around $20 billion a year could just disappear.
$20 billion. That's not small change. But okay, what are the downsides? The costs must be significant too.
Oh, absolutely. The sources are very clear on this. The big one is loss of policy autonomy. Canada might find it much harder to maintain its distinct social programs, environmental regulations, that sort of thing, if rules are harmonized continent-wide, likely leaning towards the U.S. model given its size.
That feels like a core Canadian concern.
It is. Then there's the democratic deficit. Basically, because the U.S. economy is so much larger, Canadians would have proportionally less say in setting the rules for this integrated market. And you just can't ignore the deep-seated cultural and sovereignty concerns. Polling consistently shows Canadians value their independence and are wary of political integration.
So how would it even work institutionally?
That's the big question. It's not like the EU, which built up institutions gradually over decades. North America would likely need huge, comprehensive changes, maybe even constitutional ones. USMCA provides a base, sure, but a true economic union. That requires unprecedented coordination on money, regulations, maybe even labor movement.
Are there halfway houses? Less extreme options?
Yes, and the sources discuss these. Things like deeper integration only in specific sectors, much more ambitious regulatory cooperation, expanding mutual recognition agreements, ways to get some of the economic benefits without giving up quite so much sovereignty.
Right. And this whole discussion is happening against the backdrop of that 2025 trade war between Canada and the U.S. The sources frame that as more than just a blip, right? A sign of deeper changes.
Exactly. It wasn't just another dispute. Those 25% tariffs on many Canadian goods, 10% on energy, and then Canada hitting back with $155 billion in counter tariffs. It showed how fragile even this incredibly integrated relationship can be.
What was the fallout from that?
Pretty significant.
Hmm?
Surveys showed over 56.8% of Canadian businesses exporting to the U.S. had to take action, change plans. Almost a quarter were actively looking for customers outside the U.S. manufacturing, which was hit hardest. 82.5% of affected firms faced major disruptions. Same for the auto sector.
And the overall economy.
Forecasts at the time pointed to a Canadian economic contraction through the middle of 2025. Unemployment was projected to hit its highest level since 2012. So real economic pain.
So what are the big lessons from that episode, institutionally?
Well, it showed the dispute resolution parts of USMCA weren't really up to handling a conflict that big. And the deal sunset clause, the fact that it needs periodic reviews, just adds this layer of uncertainty that makes businesses nervous about long-term investment.
Mm-hmm.
And critically, events like that just push the world further towards being more multipolar, less U.S.-centric. It forces countries like Canada to really look elsewhere. You even saw China importing record amounts of Canadian oil, $2 billion worth in 2024, partly as a result of these shifting dynamics.
Okay, so beyond the U.S. and Europe, what about these other partnerships? The sources talk about diversification insurance, using other agreements to spread the risks.
Right, and the prime example highlighted is the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's often called Canada's most successful diversification initiative so far.
Why is that? What are the results?
Well, the numbers suggest it created about 135,000 Canadian jobs. And within just the first year, exports to the new member markets grew by 25%.
25% growth is substantial.
It is. And the scope is big. It covers 580 million consumers, about 15–16% of global GDP. It gives Canada preferential access to important markets like Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia. Plus, the UK joined in 2024, adding another G7 economy. Canada saw about $3.4 billion in increased economic activity directly from it.
Is it still growing?
Potentially. There's interest from other countries. Colombia, the Philippines, South Korea, Thailand have all sort of put their hands up, so it could expand further.
And then there's Latin America. Our sources suggest that's an area we often overlook.
That's right. Export Development Canada actually flags Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, and Peru as top potential markets. And interestingly, Latin America already accounts for 60% of Canada's direct investment abroad if you exclude the top 5 developed countries.
60%, that's surprising.
It is. And the IMF expects decent growth there, around 2.7% in 2025 for the region as a whole.
Are there trade deals in place?
Canada already has agreements with Chile, Colombia, Peru. And there are ongoing talks with bigger blocs, the Pacific Alliance on one side, Mercosur on the other. So potential to deepen those ties significantly.
Any other frameworks mentioned?
Briefly, yeah. The Commonwealth sometimes comes up. Data suggests trade can be up to 50% higher between Commonwealth members just because of shared history, language, legal systems. There's the CANZ UK idea, closer ties between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. And Asia-Pacific beyond China is crucial, especially India. Forecasts see India becoming maybe Canada's fourth largest trade partner by 2040.
So lots of irons in the fire, potentially.
Potentially. But the overarching message from the sources is pretty stark. Some form of deeper economic integration, whether it's North America or Europe or CPTPP or a mix, is becoming absolutely essential for Canada's long-term competitiveness. There's a warning from the idea of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation that really sticks out.
What's that?
They basically said, Canada cannot compete in the 21st century economy with 20th century capital. A real wake-up call about the need for investment and modernization.
And that ties back to the grim picture we started with, right? 6 straight quarters of falling productivity, declining GDP per capita, business investment lagging. That investment gap with U.S. 11% of GDP versus 8%, it's not a great trend line.
Not at all. And the urgency is real. Think about it.
Right.
Over 30% of Canada's entire GDP depends on international trade. So inefficient relationships, trade barriers, missed opportunities, Canada literally can't afford them.
So integration is key, but maybe not just with the U.S.
That seems to be the suggestion. The EU model keeps coming up as a template, how integration can boost competitiveness, but may be done more gradually, sector by sector, preserving more sovereignty than a full North American Union might. And climate change as a whole new layer, right? Huge opportunities for Canada, the U.S., and the EU to work together on clean tech, aligning with Europe's Green Deal and the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay, so if you boil down all these sources, what's the recommended path forward? What's the optimal strategy?
It looks like pursuing multiple tracks at once, sort of hedging bets,
Yep.
but actively.
Yeah.
Immediate priorities seem to be, first, sort out the current trade messes, maybe strengthen the dispute resolution in USMCA. Second, really accelerate diversification, push hard on CPTPP expansion, get those Latin American deals done. And third, seriously tackle the productivity problem with domestic programs.
That's the short term. What about medium term?
Medium-term goals would be things like exploring that sectoral integration idea with different partners, beefing up regulatory cooperation across the board, and really playing Canada's strengths strategically, using its energy resources for the transition, leveraging its critical minerals.
Wow. Okay. Quite the journey we've taken. From looking at Canada's perhaps surprising economic frailties and that deep U.S. dependency, then navigating the minefield of relations with China to the brighter prospects in the EU, and then that really complex question of going deeper with North America versus spreading bets with CPTPP, Latin America, and others. It really underscores that for Canada, understanding these trade dynamics isn't just wonky policy stuff. It's fundamental to its economic future, its place in the world.
Absolutely. And the sources are pretty clear. The path forward isn't just about small adjustments. They talk about needing transformative change, which, leads to a really challenging final thought. This raises an important question for you, the listener, to think about. If you were the one advising Canada's leaders, how would you strike that balance? How do you weigh the undeniable economic logic for deeper integration against those really fundamental, deep-seated concerns about national sovereignty?